Our story takes place in the northern kingdom of Israel, around 870 BC. This was a time when Israel had split into two nations, and things were not going well spiritually. God's people had wandered so far from the covenant their ancestors made, and into this broken, drifting kingdom walked a woman whose name would become a warning for thousands of years to come. Even today, if you call someone a Jezebel, everybody instantly knows exactly what you mean. Manipulation, cruelty, corrupted power. But who was she really? Was she simply evil, born wicked from the start? Or was she something far more complicated, a woman of ambition, intelligence, and unshakable conviction who poured every ounce of her strength into the wrong cause? Stay with me, because I promise you, this is one of the most dramatic, most tragic, most talked about stories in the entire Bible. Kings, prophets, fire from heaven, betrayal, and a downfall so shocking it's still being discussed thousands of years later. This is the story of Jezebel. Jezebel was not born in Israel. She was a princess, the daughter of Baal, king of the Sidonians, a wealthy Phoenician kingdom famous for its trade ships, its silver, its purple dye, and its devotion to the god Baal and the goddess Asherah. Jezebel grew up in a palace where Baal worship wasn't just religion, it was life, it was politics, it was economy, it was identity. She would have watched the priests perform their rituals since she was a little girl, learned the chants, learned the ceremonies, and been raised to believe with her whole heart that her gods controlled the rain, the harvest, the fertility of the land, and the fate of entire nations. She was intelligent, she was strong-willed, she was strikingly capable in a world that rarely gave women any real power, and she was utterly, completely convinced that she was right. That kind of conviction, in the right hands, can build a great leader. It can inspire nations, but in the wrong hands, it can build a monster. In Jezebel's case, sadly, tragically, it built the latter. When she was given in marriage to Ahab, the king of Israel, it was a political alliance, the kind kings arranged all the time to strengthen trade routes and military ties between neighboring nations. On paper, it looked like a smart move. Sidon was rich, Israel was strategically positioned, it made sense politically. But nobody in Israel, not one person, could have possibly known just how much this single marriage would cost them. Because Jezebel didn't come to Israel to adapt to their ways, to bow to their God, or to blend quietly into palace life. She came to change them, to reshape an entire nation in the image of the God she grew up worshiping. And Ahab, weak-willed, easily influenced, hungry for her approval, simply let her. The Bible describes Ahab as a king who did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any king before him in the entire history of Israel up to that point. Read that again. Not just a bad king, the worst so far. And a huge amount of that evil had Jezebel's fingerprints all over it from the very beginning. She convinced Ahab to build a full temple for Baal right in the capital city of Samaria, the political and spiritual heart of the northern kingdom. She set up an altar for Baal inside it and even had a sacred wooden pole built for Asherah worship, right where the people would see it every single day. Then she brought in 450 prophets of Baal and another 400 prophets of Asherah, 850 false prophets total, all funded from the royal treasury, all eating comfortably at Jezebel's own table, night after night. Think about that for a moment. The queen of God's chosen people was personally funding, housing, and feeding an entire army of false prophets right under the nose of the God who delivered Israel out of slavery in Egypt. This wasn't quiet, private idol worship happening in someone's back room. This was state-sponsored, government-funded, deliberate, systematic idolatry, dragging an entire nation away from their covenant with God. And Jezebel wasn't finished, not even close. She didn't just want Baal worship to exist alongside the worship of the Lord, tolerated quietly in a corner. No, she wanted to replace the worship of the Lord completely, entirely, permanently. So she launched a brutal, sweeping campaign to hunt down and kill the prophets of the Lord across the entire kingdom, one by one, region by region. Can you imagine that kind of hatred? That kind of determination? Men who had done absolutely nothing wrong, whose only crime was speaking God's truth to a nation that desperately needed to hear it, were suddenly hunted like animals, dragged from their homes in the middle of the night, and executed on the queen's direct orders. It's honestly chilling, even now, thousands of years later, to think about how far she was willing to go to protect her power and her gods. One of Ahab's own officials, a God-fearing man named Obadiah, who somehow managed to stay in the palace despite everything happening around him, was so terrified of what Jezebel was doing that he took an enormous personal risk. He secretly hid 100 of the Lord's prophets in 2 separate caves, 50 in each, sneaking them bread and water under the cover of darkness, just to keep them alive one more day. Think about the sheer courage that took. If Jezebel had discovered what he was doing, he would have been executed too, without a second thought. That's how bad it had gotten in Israel. Faithful, godly men had to hide in caves like criminals just to survive one queen's relentless rage.
Before we continue, don't forget to like the video and subscribe so you never miss our next Bible story. And if you did like access to the character prompts that keep every scene and character consistent, simply scan the QR code or check the link in the description. Now, let's get back to our story, because the best is reserved for last.
Into this dark and dangerous kingdom walked a prophet named Elijah. Bold, fearless, and completely devoted to the Lord, without a shred of fear for kings or queens. Elijah confronted King Ahab directly, standing before the throne without flinching, and told him something absolutely terrifying. There would be no rain or dew in the land until he said so, not until God said so through him. For 3.5 brutal, punishing years, drought strangled the land of Israel. Crops withered in the fields. Rivers that had run for generations dried down to cracked mud. Livestock died. Families went hungry. Entire villages watched their futures disappear in the dust. And Ahab, instead of turning to God, blamed Elijah for all of it, calling him a troubler of Israel, even though the real cause of the suffering was the idolatry Jezebel had planted like poison across the kingdom, root and branch. During this same drought, the Lord actually sent Elijah to a poor widow in Zarephath, a Gentile woman with barely enough flour and oil to make one final meal for herself and her son. But that's a story for another day. For now, just picture it. An entire nation starving, suffering, dying slowly, while the queen who caused it feasted at her table with 850 prophets of false gods, completely untouched by the consequences of her own choices. Finally, after years of suffering, Elijah proposed a showdown, a test, a public, undeniable winner-takes-all confrontation. He challenged the 450 prophets of Baal to meet him on Mount Carmel in front of all Israel, every tribe, every witness. 2 altars would be built, one for Baal, one for the Lord. Both sides would prepare a sacrifice, laying the wood and the offering in place, but neither side would light the fire themselves. Whichever God answered by sending fire down from heaven, that would be proven once and for all as the one true God. Imagine the crowd gathering that morning, the tension, the murmuring. Everyone in Israel had heard the rumors about Jezebel's prophets, about the queen's rage, about Elijah's defiance, and now, finally, they were about to see the truth for themselves. The prophets of Baal went first. They danced, they shouted, they cut themselves with swords and spears until blood flowed, screaming and begging Baal to answer them. Nothing. Hour after hour, nothing but silence. Elijah even mocked them, saying, "Shout louder! Maybe your God is deep in thought, or busy, or traveling. Maybe he's sleeping and needs to be woken up." Can you imagine the humiliation? Hundreds of prophets, funded by the queen herself, utterly powerless in front of the entire nation. Then it was Elijah's turn. He rebuilt the altar of the Lord, dug a trench around it, and, almost unbelievably, asked for the sacrifice and the wood to be drenched in water, not once, not twice, 3 times, until the water ran down and filled the trench completely. There was no trick here, no hidden flame, just faith. Then Elijah prayed a simple prayer, and instantly fire fell from heaven and consumed the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, the soil, and even licked up every drop of water in the trench. The people fell on their faces and cried out, "The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!" It was one of the greatest displays of divine power in the entire Old Testament. And right there on that mountain, the 450 prophets of Baal were seized and put to death. You would think this would have been the turning point. You would think surely this dramatic, undeniable miracle would change Jezebel's heart. It didn't. When Ahab told her everything that had happened, how her prophets were slaughtered, how the fire had fallen, Jezebel didn't tremble, she didn't repent, she got angry, furious. She sent a messenger straight to Elijah with a chilling message. "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them." Think about the sheer, staggering defiance in that statement. This man had just witnessed fire fall from heaven, had just watched the Lord prove himself undeniably, unmistakably real and powerful in front of an entire nation. And Jezebel's response, her only response, was to threaten his life. Not to question her gods, not to wonder if she'd made a mistake, just pure, cold rage and a promise of revenge. That single moment tells you everything you need to know about who Jezebel really was at her core. Elijah, the man who had just stood fearlessly against 450 prophets, understandably ran for his life into the wilderness, so exhausted, so afraid, so utterly spent that he actually sat down under a tree and asked God to let him die. Even God's most boldest, most fearless prophet was completely broken by this one woman's fury. That's how powerful, how frightening her influence really was. But Jezebel's story of cruelty didn't end on that mountain. It got even darker. Near the palace in Jezreel, there was a small vineyard belonging to a man named Naboth. King Ahab wanted it for a vegetable garden since it was right next to the palace, and he offered Naboth a fair trade or a fair price. But Naboth refused because according to Israelite law, land was meant to stay within families. It was his inheritance passed down from his ancestors, and he wasn't willing to give it up, even to a king. Ahab went home and sulked. He lay on his bed, refused to eat, and turned his face to the wall like a spoiled child. A king pouting over a vegetable garden. When Jezebel saw her husband like this, sulking like a child over a patch of dirt, she asked him what was wrong, and when he told her, she looked at him with what I can only imagine was a mix of pity and contempt, and said something absolutely chilling. "Is this how you act as king over Israel? Get up and eat. Cheer up. I'll get you Naboth's vineyard." Notice, she didn't say, "We'll find a way." She didn't say, "Let me try to convince him." She said, quite simply, "I'll handle it." And she meant every word. Jezebel wrote letters in Ahab's own name, sealed them with his royal seal so no one would question their authority, and sent them off to the elders and nobles of Naboth's own town. In those letters, she gave precise, calculated instructions. "Proclaim a public fast," she wrote, as if something serious and holy were happening. "Seat Naboth in a prominent place of honor so the whole town would be watching. Then bring in 2 worthless scoundrels to stand up and falsely accuse him publicly of cursing God and cursing the king." Under the law, that crime carried only one punishment: death by stoning. It was cold, it was strategic, it was evil dressed up in legal procedure, and the elders of that town, terrified of what would happen to them if they disobeyed the queen, did exactly, precisely as they were told. Naboth, an innocent man whose only crime was refusing to give up his family's inheritance, was dragged outside the city walls and stoned to death on charges that were entirely, deliberately false, all so that a king could have a slightly better view from his palace window. When Jezebel heard that Naboth was dead, she went straight to Ahab and said, "Get up and take possession of the vineyard. Naboth is no longer alive, but dead." No guilt, no hesitation, just cold, calculated triumph. Ahab got up and went to claim the land, walking into that stolen vineyard like he had every right to be there. But God saw everything. He sent Elijah to meet Ahab right there in Naboth's vineyard, and the words Elijah spoke were absolutely terrifying. He pronounced that in the very place where dogs had licked up Naboth's blood, dogs would also lick up Ahab's blood. And concerning Jezebel specifically, Elijah declared that dogs would devour her flesh by the wall of Jezreel. Justice was coming. It might take years, but it was coming. Years passed. Ahab was eventually killed in battle, struck by a random arrow through a gap in his armor, just as it had been prophesied down to the smallest detail. His sons ruled after him, one after another, but the kingdom remained deeply corrupted by the idolatry Jezebel had spread for decades. She stayed in power, still influential, still dangerous, watching her sons rule in her shadow. But God had not forgotten his word. Eventually, he raised up a fierce, relentless military commander named Jehu, and through the prophet Elisha, anointed him to bring judgment on the entire house of Ahab, root and branch, exactly as Elijah had prophesied years earlier in that stolen vineyard. Jehu rode toward Jezreel with violent, unstoppable purpose. His chariot driving was famous throughout Israel. People could recognize him from a distance just by the way he drove, furiously, like a man with nothing left to lose. Everyone who saw him coming knew instinctively that something dangerous was happening. He killed King Joram, Jezebel's own son, right there in the very field that had once belonged to Naboth, and then he turned his chariot toward the palace, toward Jezreel, toward Jezebel herself. Now here's something remarkable about Jezebel, and honestly, it shows you just how unshakable, how deeply ingrained her pride really was, even staring death directly in the face. When she heard Jehu was coming, when she heard her own son had already been killed, she didn't run. She didn't hide in some back room of the palace. She didn't fall to her knees and beg for mercy. Instead, in one final, almost unbelievable act of defiance, she painted her eyes with kohl, carefully arranged her hair, and stood tall at an upper window of the palace to face him head-on. Can you imagine that kind of nerve? Even in her absolute final moments on earth, staring down the very man sent to execute God's judgment against her, Jezebel refused to show even a flicker of fear. She called down to Jehu mockingly from that window, comparing him to a murderer from Israel's own history, trying, even now, at the very end, to shame him and manipulate her way out of danger the way she had done to kings and prophets her entire life. It had always worked before. She fully assumed it would work one more time. It didn't. Jehu looked up at the window, completely unmoved by her performance, and called out, "Who is on my side? Who?" And 2 or 3 eunuchs, palace servants who had clearly had enough of Jezebel's reign of terror after all these years, looked down at him from beside her. "Throw her down," Jehu commanded without a second's hesitation. And they did. Jezebel fell from that window, and just as Elijah had prophesied years earlier in that very stolen vineyard, her body was trampled beneath the horses in the courtyard below. Later, when Jehu ordered that she be buried, after all, she was a king's daughter and deserved that much, his men went out to find her body, but by the time they arrived, there was almost nothing left, just her skull, her feet, and the palms of her hands. The dogs had eaten the rest, exactly where Elijah said they would, by the wall of Jezreel, exactly as it was written, word for word, all those years before. The woman who had once commanded prophets, kings, and armies with a single word, who had painted her face and styled her hair right up until her final breath, ended her life as scraps in the street, unburied, unremembered, exactly the way God said she would. So, what do we take from a story this dark, this dramatic, this deeply tragic? First, power without righteousness is a countdown to disaster. Jezebel had wealth, beauty, intelligence, and enormous influence, everything the world tells us we should chase after, but none of it was anchored to truth. She used every single gift she had, every ounce of her intelligence and charisma, to build something that could never actually last because it wasn't built on God, it was built on sand. And when the storm came, exactly as it always does, it all came crashing down. Second, real courage is standing for truth even if it costs you everything. Think about Obadiah risking his own life to hide 100 prophets in caves. Think about Naboth, a simple vineyard owner refusing to hand over his family's inheritance, even under direct pressure from the king himself. Neither of them were famous, neither of them had armies or palaces, but their courage mattered deeply, even when the world seemed completely stacked against them. And third, and honestly, this is the one that hits hardest for me personally, God's justice is patient, but it is never blind. It took years, sometimes even decades, for Jezebel's judgment to finally arrive. There were seasons where it must have looked from the outside like she had gotten away with everything, like evil had simply won. But it hadn't. It arrived exactly the way it was prophesied, down to the very last chilling detail. Nothing God says ever falls to the ground unfulfilled. Jezebel's name has echoed through history as a symbol of manipulation, cruelty, and corrupted power, and honestly, that reputation is well earned. But I think there's something deeply human buried underneath all of that darkness too, something worth sitting with for a moment. She was a woman utterly convinced she was right, raised from childhood to believe in a certain worldview and willing to do absolutely anything, no matter the cost, to protect what she believed in, blind, completely blind to the destruction she was causing along the way. She never once, as far as we know, paused to question whether her certainty was leading her somewhere terrible. And honestly, that's a warning for all of us, not just ancient queens sitting on ancient thrones. How many of us hold on to our own convictions so tightly that we stop listening to correction? How many of us would rather double down than admit we might be wrong? Conviction without humility is dangerous. Power without accountability is dangerous. Beauty and influence used carelessly are dangerous. And pride, no matter how beautifully it's dressed and painted at a window, still falls exactly the same way it always has, every single time. There's also Ahab in this story, someone we can't ignore. A king who had every opportunity to lead his nation well, who witnessed fire fall from heaven with his own eyes, and who still allowed his wife's influence to override what he knew deep down was true. His weakness cost him everything too. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in our own lives isn't the loud, obvious evil in front of us. It's the quiet compromise we keep allowing over and over because it's easier than standing firm. What do you think? Was Jezebel simply a villain, or was she a product of the world she was raised in, doubling down on everything she'd ever known? I would genuinely love to hear your thoughts, so drop a comment below and let's talk about it. And if this story moved you the way it moved me, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because we've got so many more powerful, true stories from Scripture coming your way. Next time, we're diving into the incredible story of Deborah, the fearless prophetess and judge who led an entire nation into battle when no man dared to step up. Trust me, you do not want to miss it. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next story.